Thanks for joining me. Effective March 15th of year, by the direction of the President, on recommendation by the CDC, further passed on to state governments, further passed to city officials, our lifestyle was affected like really no single event, at least in my lifetime, and historians say since the Second World War. Of course, we're speaking of the current pandemic that we're living in. Yes, we've had terrorist acts. I mean, we just celebrated 25 years of the Murrah bombing in Oklahoma City, and we can't forget 9/11 as well. And the results from those things that happened as far as the TSA, the origination of the TSA in our airports, the Patriot Act, et cetera, et cetera. So aside from the act itself, what is the catalyst of these events that so affect us? Again, aside from the act. Government. Government. Yeah. Sometimes we grumble about government and about its officials. But a proper respect for authority honors God. I mean, after all, it was God who established or set up this order of authority called government. We see instructions in God's Word regarding authority and government in Exodus and Daniel and Mark and Acts and Timothy and Titus and Peter, and for sure in Romans that we'll look somewhat of. And of course, Paul, who wrote Romans, had his own problems with government and those in charge, but he concluded, as we will see, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. In fact, he used the term God's ministers as he referred to the government. Let's look specifically at a few of the verses, and I encourage you to go into Romans chapter 13 and read several of at least the first 7 verses, but we won't, for the essence of time, look at that much. Verse 1 says, as I've already read, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. Why? For there is no authority except from God, and the authority that exists are appointed by God. In verse 4 it says, for he is God's ministers to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's ministers, an avenger to execute wrath on him. So, therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. So, Paul, as I said, had his problems with authority. But again, understand, Christians have a legitimate responsibility to obey government. But it is not unlimited responsibility. In fact, we need to use God's Word in all cases, to give us or be our standard for instruction. Again, I'm not promoting civil disobedience. We see a lot of that on Facebook, especially today, but we find in Exodus where, again, the midwives, showed disobedience toward Pharaoh regarding killing children. We find in Daniel, we are introduced to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who would not bow down to the golden image. In other words, worship someone other than their God. We find in Mark where Jesus' instruction says, you render unto Caesar what is Caesar, but to God what is God. And very importantly, we see Peter and John in Acts where they were challenged regarding using the word Jesus. They decided and concluded, obey God rather than men. Again, the bottom line, or the basis for our obedience, is an affirmation of God's sovereignty. Again, God set this up. He is the one who set up kings. He's the one that set up empires on this earth in order to, as we saw, to restrain and to punish men. So let God's Word teach us. Let God's Word hopefully allow us to have a healthy attitude toward government. After all, it is for our good. It is for the testimony of our faith, and more importantly, most of all, it honors God. Thank you for joining me.